Hello, I'm Pat Shelton. Tonight, Catholic Magazine presents the first of a two-part discussion marking the 10th anniversary of the U.S. Catholic Bishop's pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, God's Promise, Our Response, a significant and aggressive effort to raise serious moral questions in a moment of supreme crisis.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Paul Perello. The moment of supreme crisis that Pat Shelton mentioned in our opening arose from a fact stated in the introduction of the Peace Pastoral: nuclear war threatens the existence of our planet. This is a more menacing threat than any the world has ever known. The 10th anniversary of this document will be officially observed on May 9th. And in anticipation of that event, we have invited our guests to share their thoughts, feelings, and observations regarding this historic document. On my left is Mr. Tom O'Rourke. Tom is a member of Pax Christi and the Catholic Peace Fellowship, a former member of the Archdiocesan Commission for World Peace and Justice. Tom has been committed to peace issues for more than 25 years. To Tom's left is Sister Marie Lucy. Sister Marie is also a member of Pax Christi and the Catholic Peace Fellowship. For 15 years, she has been actively involved in peace and justice issues for her religious community, the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia, including the establishment of their Peace and Justice Office. Also on our program, we have Mr. Dick Taylor. Like Tom, Dick is also a former member of the Archdiocesan Commission for World Peace and Justice. He has extensive knowledge and experience in working for peace, social justice, and human rights. In addition to having written numerous magazine and newspaper articles, Dick is the author of 5 books, including A Peace Ministry in Practice and Nuclear Holocaust and Christian Hope. And finally, joining our panel, Mrs. Sheila Bello, a committed mother of 3 who turned a casual interest in the environment during her college years into an active pursuit of a graduate degree in environmental education. Sheila is also a member of the governing board of the Center for Celebration of Creation at the Chestnut Hill United Methodist Church, an ecumenical group working to awaken in people a sense of the imperative for a healthful relationship between humans and the earth. And Sheila is also a member of the Epiphany Parish in Norristown. I'd like to welcome you all to our program.
Good to be here.
When it became public, the first draft of the Challenge of Peace, it sparked a national debate within and beyond the church. At several stages before it was actually published, the critics speculated that some of the surprisingly strong language may have been softened. In retrospect, do any of you wish that something could have been included or dealt with more fully? Dick, let's begin with you.
Well, one of the things that I wish had been included more fully is an emphasis on nonviolent struggle and nonviolent defense. The bottom line of the Bishop's Pastoral was that they said that they stood for strictly conditioned moral acceptance of deterrence, which meant that we could keep these horrendous nuclear weapons as long as they were part of a progression toward disarmament. Now, they did treat nonviolence as another Christian tradition. They said it more truly reflects the spirit of Christ. They said it was part of the early church. They gave many examples of people using nonviolent struggle as a way to defend even nations, and they gave the example of the Danes and the Norwegians against Hitler. Mm-hmm. So they gave a very strong position on a Catholic stream of nonviolence, but in the end, they didn't go with nonviolence, they went with accepting nuclear deterrence.
And Sheila, I guess you would have also liked to see included in this letter, I guess a statement or a position on the environment.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of trying to find peace in a world where we are not at peace with our environment, we are not in harmony with our environment. It's very hard to find peace among people. And I think that is really the crux of a lot of the problems today in terms of finding peace and keeping peace in the world. And I would like to have seen that addressed a little bit more fully at that time. I mean, this was certainly an issue 10 years ago. It was an issue 25 years ago. And it was there was mention of our being stewards of the earth, but it really never went beyond a mention here or there within the Peace Pastoral. And that's certainly something I would love to have seen addressed more fully, and definitely needs to be addressed today.
Sister, why do you think that they left these two issues out, or did they just choose to ignore them?
No, in all fairness, even though I agree with both Dick and Sheila, in all fairness, I would have to say that at that moment in 1983, the nuclear crisis was seen as the crisis of the moment. Our own country was in the midst of its largest military buildup in peacetime. So I really think that's why the focus was there, though I certainly agree that today, certainly the environment, destruction of the environment must be included in any statement about peace. And then in response to Dick, while I agree that I wish that the nonviolent response had been developed more, at least I was happy to see this was a breakthrough moment, I believe, because for the first time, if I'm correct, since the 4th century, that pacifism, Christian pacifism, was held up as an acceptable moral choice, right alongside of just war. And as a Franciscan, of course, I was particularly happy that St. Francis and his way of living was held up as a model, Franciscan tradition.
Tom, if we can't get along with each other, if we can't get along with our neighbor living right next door to us, many people would say, well then, why should I have to worry about the enemy on the outside? Why should I have to worry? And I guess when Sister mentioned that this document was drawn up 10 years ago, there was the threat of the Russian bear. And we saw a proliferation, if you will, of nuclear arms. Why was so much attention paid to the enemy far away and not much paid to perhaps the person living next door?
I think the pastoral treated the close-in aspects of peacemaking also in the latter sections of the letter. As Sister Marie says, though, nuclear weapons was such a focus, and rightly so at the time, that it was necessary that the primary focus not be too distracted from that. But I was impressed that the call to peacemaking was clearly in the pastoral letter, and pretty heavily too, calling each person. In fact, at the very end, there was almost a litany of people in various occupations, and saying to each group, teachers, parents, educators, scientists, and so forth, what this call to peacemaking really means to them specifically.
What is the Catholic Church's stand then on the issue of war? In reading this document, it would seem to me that war is justified in certain cases. I mean, the Catholic Church did not make a blanket statement opposed to war, but then again, it's not fully supporting war. Can someone explain to me what the actual stance is?
Well, I'd like to comment on that I do think there's a misinterpretation of just war, and sometimes it's interpreted as meaning that, well, yes, there are good wars. Whereas both the just war theory, as limited as it is, and I think we need to move beyond that, but both the just war theory and pacifism do begin with a bias against war. And the whole history of the just war theory was way back, of course, again in the 4th century, because pacifism was the initial tradition from Jesus in the church, but how someone called to military service might respond to that. And then placing conditions. The just war theory really places conditions on war. It is not saying that war is a good thing. And as I said, it's very limited.
Yeah, I'd just like to amplify what Sister's just said, because when we are summoned to war by our leaders, the Catholic response, the Christian response, necessarily is no as a starting position, because that's what the gospel calls us to. The life and example of Jesus calls to that. And then the just war principles are intended to make war very difficult. In other words, we have to examine this situation, we're called to war, and to say this is one of those extreme moments of history, one of those rare moments in history where the gospel has to be put aside so that we can attack this evil. And it's really intended, that's what the just war principles are intended to do, make war very difficult. I'm not saying that's borne out in practice, but that is the way it is intended.
That's the theory, at least.
Yeah.
Now, when we discuss war, since this letter was issued on May 3rd in 1983, we have seen the Persian Gulf War. We've seen a number of other skirmishes, and I guess some people would even say, Dick, that it really wasn't a war that was fought. It was a crisis. It was a conflict. There was never really a declaration of war. Now, some may say, well, it's a matter of semantics. What was set down here in 1983, as it applies to us today, do these same things that were set down 10 years ago to apply to conflicts, military conflicts, crises, and not war in the true sense of war?
Well, I think they apply in the sense that if you're coming out of the just war tradition, you want to look at any conflict where you might use armed methods of response, military methods of response, and you want to try to judge them by the 9 criteria of just war theory. So they do apply. If you come out of the nonviolence tradition, as I do, which is a strong, although minority tradition in the church, then you would say that that last resort, which is a just war principle, always has to be pursued much, much farther than most people do. In other words, you would not go to armed struggle unless you had really tried every nonviolent means, and nonviolent means not just negotiation, diplomacy, those kinds of things, but actually even intervening bodily between warring forces, as has sometimes been done nonviolently in history.
Okay. Let's discuss the Peace Pastoral in action. It was intended to speak to the Catholic faithful as well as a wider civil community. In what ways then have the Catholic faithful responded to the challenges?
Well, you were just talking about the Persian Gulf situation as a typical example, Paul, and I was disappointed in the response that we saw at that time. Seems to me, with grounded as we are in the life and example of Jesus and the gospel, that there should be an identifiable difference in the way a Catholic responds to the summoning to war, or a Christian responds to that same call, than we saw. And I did not observe that in the society at the time, that there was not an identifiable difference. Once the call to war was issued and the war actually began, I didn't see the difference, and maybe others feel differently about that.
No, and I think it's unfortunate in all these conflicts that we have seen, the invasion of Panama, the invasion of Grenada, the Gulf War, that the bishops themselves weren't inspired by their own document to speak out in a much stronger way against invasion and against these conflicts, pursuing, as Dick had said, all nonviolent means, possible. And we became engaged in that Gulf War situation, so there really wasn't leadership, I don't believe, in the church. And
in fact, it was interesting that President Bush didn't have any such reservations. I mean, I saw our own leaders carefully examining the thing, but being somewhat tenuous about their invoking even of the just war principles. But the president appeared before a group of religious broadcasters, and at the time stepped through the just war principles and announced the war to be morally justified.
I think there is a positive side, though, in terms of the ordinary Catholic folk, parishioners, where the rubber hits the road is in the parishes. And back when this was written, there were, in Philadelphia Archdiocese, for example, about a dozen parish peace and justice groups, which was great, right at the local level. But now there are 90 such groups. About a third of the parishes in the Philadelphia Archdiocese now have peace and justice groups. And I think that's partly the influence of this kind of teaching. And they've done really interesting things, like St. Charles Borromeo Parish, I believe it's in Drexel Hill, asked its parishioners to wear white ribbons as a stand against domestic violence. They worked with their school to develop a peace and justice curriculum right in the school. Mount Carmel Church in Doylestown made a peace garden, and they march from their parish in Stations of the Cross down to the Willow Grove Naval Air Station. They've done some very dramatic things around peace and justice. So I think there is a way in which the Catholic faithful are becoming much more involved in peace and justice than they were 10 years ago.
Is part of the problem the media today, in the fact that when we had World War I and World War II, and even the Vietnam War, when the facts and figures were coming back to us here in the United States, they were being filtered or censored to a certain degree, and what the public was getting was maybe the military's version of what they wanted us to know. But with the Persian Gulf War, we saw it instantaneously happening as it was occurring via CNN and all the other news outlets. And it's very hard as a Catholic community, as a Christian community, to decide or decipher whether or not the military conflict or the military action that was taking place was in fact justified.
That's true. You're seeing this in real time. It's as if you're watching this degradation of the environment, the destruction, the killing that was going on in real time. It really, I think, has more of an impact on individuals and certainly more people in parishes then willing and wanting to get involved with peace and justice issues when they see that happening, right on your TV. That's
And the fact of the matter is, if you're seeing something on Monday, by the time you get to church on Sunday, chances are the pastor of that parish may choose to ignore what has occurred, or may not even address it, or address it in a very nonchalant way. That there's why wasn't there a number of vigils or parishes opening their doors for the faithful to come in and to have an open dialogue on what was going on in the Persian Gulf? Why do you think that we didn't see that in terms of putting this letter into action?
Well, there are a couple of points here. For one, the pastoral itself was a very strong statement, but there really wasn't much pedagogy around the statement. I think it did take hold in some parishes, in some universities, in some schools, etc. But I think for the wider Catholic audience, I doubt if many people heard many homilies, that were based on the pastoral. I don't know how many schools and universities really took it to heart. I think there could have been better teaching through these 10 years about the pastoral itself, so that when the moment of crisis came, again, such as in the Gulf War, that people's hearts and minds would have been better prepared to respond. And instead, I think what happened was maybe the media, the closeness, the immediacy had something to do with that, but people reacted kind of out of what they saw as patriotism, which I think was a pseudo-patriotism, but they didn't have a grounding in the real teaching that could have been associated with the pastoral.
That struck me too, Marie. When the war came and the bishops, you could fault them, some people would fault them, but I thought about that and thought they don't really have a constituency for speaking boldly. We haven't really been conditioned to challenge the government when it issues a summons to war, and I mean challenge in a very healthy way, with true patriotism, and to say, no, this is not one of those exceptional moments in history where I personally can supersede the gospel, that it's more serious than that, and take that kind of, but I don't think we were conditioned historically to take that kind of a position.
So then would you say that we failed or succeeded if we failed in our own church or our own little world in advancing the cause for peace, then we really didn't have much of an impact outside of our church or our communities, did we? Or have we?
Are you talking about the Gulf War now specifically?
Yeah, we're talking about a series of events that took place, and as Tom mentioned, we didn't challenge the gospel, we didn't challenge our church leaders, we didn't challenge our political leaders. So therefore, if we failed on the religious or the moral end of things, then we really didn't influence our neighbors that may be of another religious persuasion.
I think that's true. Another thing that you mentioned was the press coverage of the war and how it's real time and so on. And yet one of the principles of just war theory is discrimination, that your military effort has to be aimed at a military target or at the aggressor. It can't be aimed at innocent people. And the military was very careful in its reporting on the war to talk about these smart weapons that we have, as though they were very discriminating in hitting only military targets. And it only came out later how many thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians were killed and have been injured. And then because of the destruction of the infrastructure in Iraq, how many people are suffering even today.
Yes, I just saw a report last week that I think it was UNICEF that issued the report saying that in 1993 there will be 100,000 more deaths, mostly of children, as a result of the war that would not have otherwise been casualties.
If I could insert here, Paul, too, and while I think there wasn't a strong enough Catholic Christian voice, I would hesitate to assume that peacemaking is only confined to Catholics, to Christians, because shalom are basic principles also of the Jewish faith, of the Hebrew tradition, and also of Islam. So I think what we found at that time, that you had sections or components, groups of people across religious traditions who were speaking out against that war with interfaith rather than a strong Catholic Christian.
That's true.
There also seemed to be a response to, of course, from my point of view, the environmental degradation and destruction that took place, especially after the Gulf War. I think that was more apparent. There was some of that awareness after Vietnam with the defoliation and the problems with Agent Orange. But I think after the Gulf War, it became so apparent. We're watching oil wells burn, watching people's livelihood be destroyed as the waters in the Gulf were ruined and the shellfish industry was destroyed, and the air was just polluted. I mean, these sorts of things. This effect of war, I don't think, has been taken into consideration sometimes in trying to decide, well, is it just or isn't it just? But some of the long-range environmental effects on the people and on the land really have not been, I don't think,
and also the preparation
fully.
for war, too. I think that by far the most serious nuclear waste problem has to do with the military, construction of military weapons, nuclear weapons.
Let's discuss the letter in relation to current world events then. The Bishops' Committee noted the importance of a vision of hope in the peace pastoral. In light of recent world events, are there indications that as a civil or Christian community we have become hopeful, or have we become hopeless, complacent, or perhaps even arrogant about shaping a peaceful world?
Well, I think there are reasons for hope and there are reasons for lack of hope, if you will. In terms of hope, I mentioned the emphasis that the bishops put, though not sufficient emphasis, but the emphasis that they put on nonviolence in the pastoral. And when you think of what's happened in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, how the end of communism was brought about to a significant degree by nonviolent movements. You think of Solidarity in Poland, for instance, and I heard a Polish member of Solidarity speak on this, and he said, you know, we brought about our revolution against our totalitarian government without even breaking a window. It wasn't even a matter of killing somebody. We didn't even break a window in our movement because it was strikes and boycotts and totally nonviolent kind of resistance. So I think that we've seen some dramatic and very encouraging nonviolent resistance in recent years. Also, the strengthening of the UN has been very positive and very good. And also, I think the disarmament that is beginning with the Cold War being over, it's not enough, and yet I think that's a very encouraging sign that we're finally being able to begin to slim these enormous arsenals that we have.
But you mentioned disarmament, and you're talking about the United States disarmament and the Soviet disarmament, but there's still the fear out there, these third world countries that are now gaining the technology to build nuclear arms that could be used against us as well as Russia. So are we getting a little complacent because we feel that the Soviet bear, as I said at the beginning, has gone into his cave to sleep a very long nap?
I don't think we're getting complacent at all. In fact, I think sometimes that argument that you're using is used to justify continued nuclear development, because we still know that there's a significant portion of our national budget is allotted to even developing new weapons, going into SDI, brilliant pebbles, that type of thing. These third world nations, I think we have to question, where have they gotten the technology? Where have they gotten some of their weapons? Our defense contractors sell weapons to third world countries. So I still think a lot of the responsibility comes to our doorstep, and we cannot use that argument. We all have to disarm. But because of the leadership, the strength of the military of the United States, certainly we need to assume responsibility for greater leadership than we've taken.
I think, Paul, you asked about should we be hopeful at this time, and as Dick says, there are reasons to be hopeful and also to be pessimistic. But I just look upon this situation as energizing to me personally. Looking at the scenes in Bosnia, what it tells me is that it's another failure of the war system with which we have lived since humanity came onto the earth. And it's time now to take more seriously the things that, like Dick was talking about, and I too was struck by the Poland, which was the first of the Eastern Europe countries to fall, and it did it in a nonviolent way, and it was without preparation. They just did it. They kind of put it together as they went. Imagine if you prepared for that kind of prepared a nonviolent defense.
In the minute that we have left, and again, we tend to we as a society, not the Catholic Church, not any segment of society, but we as the entire society tend to get complacent to a certain degree, and we like to sit back and feel comfortable because we don't have to worry about the enemy beating on our door anymore. In the minute that we have left, how should we move forward from here to promote the peace cause, to promote the issue of peace because, well, yeah, our enemy is no longer, Russia, so I don't have to worry about it. But yet, the promotion of peace should be an ongoing thing. We've started something here. What should we be doing on the outside when we leave here? Dick or Tom, either one?
One thing, we've been talking about international relations a lot. I think one of the main disarmament questions is the disarmament of our own society. We have a situation now where 5,000 young people are killed every year by handguns, by weapons, where 50,000 every year are injured because of shootings. And I think gun control in the United States is something we must not overlook. It's also an issue of disarmament and peacemaking.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And also I'm mindful that this is the Easter season while we address this question. And when we speak about hope, we don't have any right not to be hopeful, as hard as it is, I think, that we are Easter people. It's a time of hope. And I think this is also a moment for deepening, looking inward to our own hearts and minds and examining our own attitudes in relation to violence and nonviolence.
At each celebration of the Mass, we make the sign of peace. In the Peace Pastoral, the Committee of Bishops encourage us to make this sign of peace as an authentic sign of our reconciliation with God and with one another. They further stated that the sign of peace is a visible expression of our commitment to work for peace as a Christian community. Although we have to close our program for this week, we will again be joined by our guest on our next edition of Catholic Magazine. I'm Paul Perello, and I hope you'll join us for that program.
Pope Paul VI said, "If you want peace, work for justice." In the Peace Pastoral of 1983, the relationship between peace and justice is clearly stated. Next week, we continue our discussion on the connection between justice and peace. Won't you please be with us? I'm Pat Shelton. Thank you for watching Catholic Magazine.
For further information about Pax Christi and the Catholic Peace Fellowship, call 215-665-0480. For information about the Center for the Celebration of Creation, call 215-242-9321. Videotapes are available by calling 215-668-9842.
We welcome your comments, suggestions, and donations and encourage you to write us at Catholic Magazine, St. Charles Seminary, 1000 East Wynwood Road, Overbrook, PA, 19096, or call us during regular business hours at 668-9842. SEP materials for Catholic Magazine provided by Tague Lumber Incorporated, serving the Delaware Valley for over 75 years. And by John Wanamaker, fine stores in the Delaware Valley.
Here's one time it doesn't matter who your neighbor is. Here's the other. Life's too short. Stop the hate.